Good morning. Today's assignment is to look at a very important scholar in African American studies who is Sylvia Frey. And at the end of this video, I'll show you how to find the items you need on Blackboard. But I wanted to begin with showing you this article that is also on Blackboard. Frey's The American Revolution and the Creation of a Global African World. This is 25 pages and it's pretty dense reading. So when I give you difficult readings like this by African American studies scholars, I make these mini lectures and give you tools to help you understand the key concepts and questions. Tools include, in this case, a digital storytelling accompaniment to the article, some highlights that I made in the article, and also a quiz with the key points I would like you to remember and understand. So, without further ado, Frey's article is about using this term, the Black Atlantic, rather than the term African diaspora. African diaspora is a term that many African American and Africana studies scholars use because diaspora simply means the dispersal of people throughout the world. So in this image, you can see that people from Africa went in practically every direction and importantly for our considerations ended up over here in the Americas. One thing that Frey wants us to think about is to place the origins of African American activism in the American Revolution rather than in the Pan-African movement, so that's another important term, Pan-African, or in the Back to Africa movement. So essentially, what Frey tells us is that Pan-Africanism started in the 1900s with the Pan-African Congresses, organized in part by W.E.B. Du Bois, first one here in 1919. In 1800s, there was something called the African Colonization Movement, and this image is Martin Delany, who was a very important figure in the Civil War, but also prior to the Civil War and the Freedmen's Bureau, Delany tried to organize a colonization or back to Africa movement in the 1850s. He was a colleague of Frederick Douglass. He originally started writing The North Star with Frederick Douglass. But what Frey wants to do is call our attention to earlier movements that come before Pan-Africanism, and she's particularly interested in the 1700s, a time in which the Black Atlantic, meaning people in Africa, the Americas, Europe, and the Caribbean, started contributing in very important ways to Black activism. She also questions the term African diaspora because she, like Nathan Van Sertima, talks about how the African diaspora started 1,500 years before the Black Atlantic or the slave trade or the Atlantic diaspora. This is an image of a book called They Came Before Columbus, and it's about how in 814 BC, Africans probably traveled to the Americas for cultural exchange and just exploration without trying to exploit anybody. And Frey's argument is that people from Africa remembered Africa and that the homeland, memories of the homeland remained strong, and we can find plenty of evidence of that in the Americas starting in the 1700s. They remembered Africa as the home of the ancestors and a place of freedom, and this memory of Africa, particularly in the 1700s, remained important to African American culture and history thereafter. So some of the figures she looks at as important people in the Black Atlantic are this woman, Rebecca Proughton, who was an evangelist who traveled from the Caribbean to Denmark in the 1740s. Now, the reason I'm rushing through this article by Frey and why it's so important is because African American studies very often centers on history. And the history that you learn in school might begin with Harriet Tubman and slavery. And that is a misrepresentation of African and African American history. If we think about Africans, free Africans traveling to the Americas in 814 BC, we have to readjust our timeline. For Frey's purposes, we primarily readjust the timeline back to the 1700s. So she talks about Rebecca Broughton here, who was an evangelist and a Moravian as part of the Black Atlantic Revolutionary tradition. She then tells us about David the African, who was in South Carolina, particularly in Charleston, and who compared the bondage of people of African descent to the Egyptians in bondage. And we'll talk about that more with Eddie Glaude and the Exodus story tomorrow. Also, many people, men of African descent, and here is an image, I think, of Paul Cuffey, and here are several images of Olaudah Equiana, and there is also here an image of Kobno Koguana, difficult names. These are African men who lived in slavery but became sailors and got out of slavery, then wrote really important texts in the 1700s about freedom and equality. So this is part of the Black Atlantic Revolutionary tradition that Frey wants us to know about and thinks it's very important for us to think about. Part of the reason I would say this is terribly, terribly important in African American studies is that many white nationalists today talk about the founding fathers and go back to Thomas Jefferson as the person who was enlightened and understood all about freedom. And while I agree that Thomas Jefferson was a great man, I think there are others. Here is an image of Prince Hall. Here is a piece, another writing by Britton Hammond. Here's another image of Hall. Here's an African Masonic Lodge as founded by Hall. And there were people of African descent, men and women, Black people who, even before the American Revolution, even before Jefferson, were writing about freedom and deliverance and salvation and exodus from slavery to freedom, who truly understood the Enlightenment, which is the idea that every person has the capacity to know freedom and to do the right thing. These are Black people that were writing in the Americas about these topics before Thomas Jefferson did. So considering that many white nationalist movements today put the greatness of the United States in Thomas Jefferson, knowing that there were men and women before Jefferson saying the same things and that these were Black people, often from Africa, really gives us some talking points when we talk about white supremacy and white nationalism. Okay, so back to Africa movement, starting in the 1700s. People of African descent, Blacks who were temporarily enslaved in the Americas and the Caribbean in the United States, who saw Africa as their homeland and wanted to go home. These people included Cogoano and Equiano and John Marrant, and they were the forebears of Prince Hall, Paul Cuffey, and Marcus Garvey, as well as Martin Delany. Now, in the American Revolution, and we're moving forward here in a timeline as well, as you know, France helped the United States in the Revolution. And the French soldiers sent some African, Haitian soldiers as well, including Henri Christophe, who became one of the emperors of Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. So the Sons of Africa, inspired by the Sons of Liberty, petitioned for the end of slavery in the United States in the early 1700s. Meanwhile, they talked about the right of nature, the light of nature, the dictates of reason, and all the things that Jefferson talked about long before Jefferson spoke of them. So during the American Revolution, there were many black soldiers who fought. And as I was saying before, there were men from Haiti who fought in the American Revolution. 10 years later, 15 years later, they would start their own revolution on the island of Haiti and make Haiti the first free black nation in the Western Hemisphere. The connection between fighting in military service, fighting in revolutions, and fighting for freedom and abolition established itself then. And here we are going to see a little bit more about the importance of the Haitian Revolution to freedom and abolition in the United States. So here is our picture of Henri Christophe, who fought in Savannah. Here is an image of the Haitian Revolution. And here is an image of some of the soldiers who fought in the Haitian Revolution. And this particular image doesn't necessarily represent what these men looked like. It was how they imagined them to look. And during the abolition movement in the United States in the 1800s, from 1840 to 1865, the Haitian Revolution was a tremendously important inspiration to end slavery in the United States. It was important to black abolitionists in the United States prior to the Civil War and to many white abolitionists as well. And here is another picture supposedly of Prince Hall, back to the top of our stack, although I think that's Prince Hall's son. I'm not sure that's actually Prince Hall. I'm pretty sure that is not a portrait of Henri Christophe. It's just how people assumed Henri Christophe might have looked. And many of these paintings and these portraits were made after these men died. So it's a little bit like having a portrait of Jesus Christ. We have many paintings and portraits and representations of Jesus, but none of them are the actual likeness of him, other than supposedly the sacred Shroud of Turin. But in the case of the Haitian Revolution, people tried to imagine what these men looked like after the fact. And very often you will see incorrectly attributed photos of these early black leaders on blogs and all kinds of internet resources. So, the Battle of Savannah, largely won by soldiers who would later fight in the Haitian Revolution. There is the first reference of the importance of the Haitian Revolution to anti-slavery and the American Revolution. The rumor that there was a great war coming to help the black people. In a South Carolina slave called Jeremiah helped them to believe that what had happened in Haiti could inspire freedom in the Carolinas as well. And Frey tells us that nowhere did the tree of liberty sink deeper roots than in Saint-Domingue, when the Haitian Revolution started in 1791 and opened a new chapter in revolutionary history. So here is a map of the island of Haiti, which, as I have said several times now, inspired many movements for freedom in the United States, including what I hope you have heard about, Denmark Vesey's plotted revolt to abort slavery in South Carolina in 1822. Here is Denmark Vesey's house that you can see in present-day Charleston. And there's controversy about Denmark Vesey and what he really tried to do or whether he was framed. I believe Denmark Vesey really was inspired by meeting people who emigrated from Haiti to South Carolina and even to New Orleans and Louisiana. Black people who knew it was possible to fight for their freedom and create their own free country. And like I said, Vesey's home still standing. I stood in front of it in Charleston myself. Vesey planned to lead African Americans who were enslaved out of the United States and take those people to Haiti. Nat Turner planned to sail people to Haiti because it was a free black nation. And there were many other plans to go to Haiti to find freedom in addition to going to the United States to find freedom. And this is all happening in the 1700s, continuing into the 1800s. So those are the key points in Frey's essay. You can read Frey's entire essay yourself if you have time and inclination. You can just watch this sway and try to catch the main points. Oops, sorry. This stuff isn't supposed to be open. And another strategy that you can use to learn the material I don't know what's happening on that page, is to take the quiz a couple of times, meaning you can take the quiz, you can watch this video, and then you can take the quiz again. So sorry, I hate to waste time like this, and I try to make these videos a lot shorter, but Blackboard's giving me a fight right now. So here's my courses. And what the heck? I'm sorry, Blackboard's being so stupid. These aren't what my favorites are supposed to be. I just wanted to show you the quiz. I don't know why it's showing me all of these different things. We have a quiz in the Frey article. You can take the quiz multiple times. That's my point. I'll show you that again quickly tomorrow. I'm sorry that I can't get Blackboard to behave right now. I'll also put a link to this sway in our folder. And I'm going to cut this short right now because I hate to waste your time. But have a great day.